And game number 4 brings us to Snowplow. Our allies player in the north, he is Cyan, he is YuiYui. His opponent in the south as the Blue Empire, once again, a random empire, he is mates Dankal. Opening up so far, triple dojo. Is it going to be actually quad dojo? It is indeed. And if you're wondering why, it's going to be because there is 2 oil derricks, and sometimes Empire players can actually secure both of them, so they do like to try. However, it looks like YuiYui is going to be going for a dual racks opener, and then the power plant gets thrown down out here on the water, and he packs up his MCV to go ahead and go for yet another MCV push. And of course there will be some turrets involved, and there will be a lot of infantry. So Dankal, can he actually stop that engineer? There's actually a dog going to be heading out on the other side of the map for YuiYui, and Dankal is going to be looking to grab both of those oil derricks if he can. That will give him a nice economic edge, but again, how much do economics actually matter when YuiYui is playing this hyper-aggressive blitz, let's end the game sort of style? So he is going to be moving forward with his MCV, clearing out some of these buildings, because as long as YuiYui wins, he doesn't care how efficient he plays. It looks like he may actually be losing his engineer, and he does indeed. It gets taken out right there. And then he is going to be able to, Dankal rather, is going to be able to grab both of the oil derricks without too much trouble. And of course, that's the problem when YuiYui does something like this. He can't really be too concerned when he just loses a unit off to the side there, or doesn't get an oil derrick. He's of course not really looking to play the long game. However, Dankal is going to be able to send a refinery. Once again, he continues to open up this 3 refinery style, and you'd think instead of going like 3 refinery with 2 of them in his main base, he would go 3 refinery, and on this map maybe 1 over here and then another over here. And so he's got 1 in his main base, and then the other 2 are spread out across the map instead of opening 2 refinery in his main base. These are not going to be normal games, and he should definitely know that by now. This is a best of 7 series, and there is lots of opportunity for these players to get to know each other, and it's very clear what YuiYui plans on doing. However, it looks like the dog was able to snipe it down, that Imperial Warrior, but not before the Imperial Warrior was able to cut down that Javelin Trooper. The MCV is desperately trying to escape, but of course YuiYui is going to be staying on its tail really quite well, and he is going to be able to potentially take it out entirely just with the Peacekeepers. It looks like a Javelin Trooper is going to be getting mixed in there, and YuiYui is going to have to deal with... Oh, he actually loses the Javelin Trooper there, a little bit of a micro mistake, but not too big of a deal as long as he's still got some DPS on this MCV. It looks like one of the refineries is going to be getting cleared up. The other one is safe for now, and the Harvesters could potentially be used in combination with some of the Imperial Warriors to make sure that there's extra damage going out on the army of YuiYui. And as you can see, the MCV of Dankal is getting exceedingly close to death, and tried to do some damage there. Wasn't sure if he was actually able to, and the MCV is going to be making the long trek over the course of this bridge, but there is going to be some laser locking happening, and this is going to be a very dangerous situation to be in for Dankal, as his MCV is still on the bridge, and the bridge collapses. So YuiYui able to strike down the MCV of Dankal, despite the fact that he was quite a far ways away from it, and now Dankal only has 2 oil derricks and 1 refinery, as his refinery in his house actually does go down. Some really nice control here by YuiYui. Dankal doing his best to clean up those units, but the infantry are just not going to be too strong in terms of not getting crushed. However, it looks like we do have a barracks on each side of the map, so there are still production facilities, and there is still eco for Dankal, but can he clean things up? Because of course YuiYui can just retreat to the water. Excellent refinery placement here. If you're wondering why that happened, it happened when YuiYui's MCV was actually in the middle there, and he didn't actually have enough build radius to place it properly, so that's why that happened. And YuiYui, yeah, as long as he stays out on the water, the only thing that Dankal can do to kill stuff out on the water is burst drones. And, I mean, burst drones are notoriously bad versus buildings. So as long as he still has, like, say, a multi-gun or turret, YuiYui almost cannot lose this. If he runs back out onto the land, then there's a potential for some sort of draw or a loss situation for YuiYui. But Dankal, he's lost his MCV, and he has only barracks production facilities, and of course barracks, they don't have anything that shoots up, so, or of course goes out on the water, which means that if YuiYui ends up getting something like, say, an airfield and Vindicator, something that is very good for an allied player to get, then he's going to be in a very safe situation. Dankal is sort of holding on here. He's seeing if he can do any damage. I mean, I believe this power plant is going to be close enough to the shore to actually be picked off there, but of course this stuff out here, and that airfield actually might be close enough to get to the shore to be picked off as well, but the MCV, as long as it stays out at sea, I'm not actually sure why YuiYui is going to be moving out onto the land. One thing that he can do in this situation is just end the game a little bit quicker, but that also puts him at a slightly larger risk, as his infantry army isn't necessarily as strong as Dankal, since Dankal actually does have barracks and YuiYui does not. So Dankal is going to be able to constantly produce units as long, well, he's got 30 credits every 2 seconds, so it's not quite a constant stream of units, and he could actually sell off one of the barracks and then sort of concentrate all of his forces on one part of the map. As you can see, Dankal has been defeated. He was going to go and try to hit that refinery, but it wouldn't quite work, so YuiYui is going to be taking a 1-point lead, 3-2, which means that this is the potential match point, because if YuiYui wins this next game, the series will be over and he will walk away with that prize money, but we will have to see exactly what happens. Again, graphs even less important in now than they are in other matches, but I mean, as you can see economically, Dankal was way ahead. Let's see, actually, wow, a whole 12,000 credits were harvested for Dankal, but of course he wasn't actually able to put that to work for him, but that will be doing it for this game. This is going to be Sybert jumping into the next game. And game number 5 takes us to Cabana Republic, where the blue allies in the west, he is Mates Dankal, and his opponent, the Cyan allies in the east, he is YuiYui. So YuiYui, as you can see, which this is not something we see very much in this series, we have walls. Those walls would indicate that YuiYui is actually intending to get a refinery in his main base, which is very exciting for this series. We do have a dual racks opener up for Dankal and a single racks opening up for YuiYui. So as you can see, YuiYui has entirely secured one refinery, well, at least one refinery location for himself. And Dankal is going to be opening up fairly standard. As you can see, he is setting himself up to wall in those. Oh, and what is this? Is that actually... that's a refinery, and that's another refinery location. We are going to be seeing 2 refineries out of YuiYui. I was never more excited to see 2 refineries than when I was casting this with Goldie, and we're like, oh my gosh, is he actually going to do it? Is YuiYui actually going to play something that isn't a one or no refinery push? Dankal, as you can see, he's setting up some very nice walls here. He's going to be able to wall off the power plant with the refinery, and his second refinery should be going down relatively soon here. I'm not actually sure why it's not. He does have a dog going to be sending out around the map. The second refinery already up for YuiYui, and Dankal's refinery quite a far bit behind. I'm not actually sure how much YuiYui is going to be able to refine at that point. The engineer did go ahead and grab that oil derrick for YuiYui. Dankal is going to be doing the same, and as you can see, these 2 players are going to be contesting the buildings in the center of the map. Dankal does have eyes on YuiYui, and for once, he's actually like, what? I actually wonder, maybe that's what Dankal was waiting for. He was waiting for the dog to get in there and actually see what YuiYui is doing, and then he saw, your MCV is still here. You've got 2 I guess I can go ahead and get my own second refinery? It was just such a bizarre series to play, and I actually understand that both of these players are a little bit off their game. As I mentioned, the conditions for these matches were not ideal, and yet both of these players did decide to play them anyways, so big shoutouts to them for sticking it out and playing these awesome matches. YuiYui is going to be moving out with his MCV, so he's at least got 2 refineries, a naval yard, and a couple of power plants out before his MCV move. Both of the oil derricks have been grabbed, and in this allied mirror matchup, every single unit is pretty darn important. However, we do have an airfield, so Riptides versus Vindicators, but also we do have hydrofoils here out on the map. And if YuiYui is paying attention and micros well, then of course the weapon jamming ability of those hydrofoils can be exceedingly powerful. However, it is going to be a fast tier 2 out of YuiYui, and he is going to be using that for some cryocopters. So that's going to be a nice little trick there for Dankal, because of course cryocopters will potentially allow him to be super effective with things like peacekeepers and just freeze down units like riptides that he wouldn't necessarily be able to kill super easily. And of course, the bad thing about hydrofoils, the bad thing for YuiYui, is that they do not go on land. So while he may have a lot of forces on land, he needs to make sure that he keeps the hydrofoils as close as he can. YuiYui also going to be throwing some dogs out around the map. Dankal is going to be moving his MCV and getting potentially a third refinery. But also, what is that? Is that a third refinery for YuiYui? Yes, indeed it is. Refineries galore for YuiYui. However, it's not so much harvesters. However, this is a really great move by Dankal. By YuiYui. Is actually focusing down the Vindicator before the Cryocopter. A lot of players try to focus the Cryocopter first, and that harvester does survive. However, if you focus the cryocopter first, most of the time you're not going to be able to shoot it down with just one Apollo before it freezes, and then the Vindicator can still drop its bombs off. However, if you focus the Vindicator first, it doesn't matter if that cryocopter finishes it, because there's nothing there to do the DPS. What Dankal tried to do, and actually YuiYui made the mistake of actually rebuilding that harvester, which, I mean, YuiYui in previous series, he would actually rebuild the harvesters, start rebuilding them rather, before they got taken out. So it's like, okay, you killed my harvester, but I actually lost 0 mining time for it, because he would time his harvesters to come out just as the other harvester died. And it's actually a really nice move on YuiYui's part, and something that I would definitely encourage other players to start doing. If you're in a situation where you know you're going to lose your harvester, just go ahead and start rebuilding a little bit early. If it's like, I think I can save it, then you don't necessarily, you shouldn't necessarily. But of course, that's a call that you will have to be making. However, Dankal parked his cryocopter directly over the frozen harvester, hoping that when the Apollo shot down the cryocopter, it would do just a little bit of damage. Because if you didn't know, things like Apollos, I don't know about Vindicators, but definitely Apollos, when they crash down, they do just a little bit of damage to whatever they land on. And of course, the boot camp does go down. That Rax is going to be established on the ground for YuiYui. While in the meantime, Dankal is actually going to be clearing out this building. And as long as he controls this building, he can do a little bit of damage to that, to the refinery of YuiYui. Dankal is not going to be adding on too many more air units if he can help it. He would like to get the DPS out there, but does he actually have the money for it? His MCV once again out on the move, and these Riptides need to be dealt with right now. As you can see, YuiYui is going to be turret pushing, and is he going to be able to take out the Prospector and the Refinery, or will he only be able to take out one of those targets? The Hydrofoils are standing by, one of them in weapon jamming, one of them just in regular fire mode, and a second multi-gunner turret is going to be going down on land. We do have one of the power plants is going to be getting focused here by the Riptide. However, it does look like multi-gunner turret's going to be going down for Dankal as well. However, the Riptides are going to be potentially supported by that Apollo. One refinery does go down, the other one does still stand, and also additional walls are going to be built up here for Dankal. The cryocopter does finally get out a second cryocopter. That was definitely a mistake by Dankal letting the cryocopter get taken out, which is of course easy to say when we know that it didn't actually kill anything. But of course Dankal had to make that split-second decision, and Dankal is going to be cleaning up that entire attack force, which is a really great move for Dankal. A couple of Javelin Troopers are going to be added on by YuiYui, which is nice unit mixing. Of course, the Hydrofoils will be adding some anti-air, but also mixing in those Javelin Troopers with the Peacekeepers. You don't want to go with just one or the other. You want to make sure that you have both, and maybe even mix in a couple of attack dogs. So Dankal trying to go for the crush there, but he wasn't quite able to. YuiYui going to be throwing down a wall, or a barracks rather, on the other side of the walls, and also going to be throwing down a boot camp just to make sure that he's got that extra damage output in Dankal's face, because YuiYui desperately wants to close this series out, and if he wins this game, he will do exactly that. 3 Apollos out on the field for YuiYui, but The airfield did get sold off, which means we'll most likely be seeing a proxy airfield out of YuiYui, and he might actually have enough time and money to set up some refineries in his opponent's main base, which just kind of adds insult to injury. It looks like we do have a couple of Apollos of Dankal going to be getting cleaned up by YuiYui, which is definitely the right thing to do by YuiYui, because if he can clear the skies, then that means that the cryocopters are not going to be nearly as effective, or even the Vindicator as well, are not going to be nearly as effective as they would be if Dankal owned the airspace. A couple of Apollos for Dankal are going to be making sure they have eyes on everything, and YuiYui is going to have to be careful with his own Apollos, because he can catch a bad angle of engagement, potentially, but of course, if he's paying attention, then his 4 Apollos will of course shred the 2 Apollos of Dankal. Dankal forced to move his MCV. YuiYui is going to be establishing an additional refinery in the main base. And let's do a quick check. We've got 2, 3, well, no harvester there, so kind of just 2, and 4. So we've got 4 mining refineries for YuiYui. Absolutely fantastic play. That one does get sold off, so he's able to recap some of the money lost there. Well, some of the resources that he spent there, or at least I believe it was sold off. The Peacekeepers are going to be regrouping with the rest of Dankal's forces, and Dankal has just been forced all over the map, and maybe going for a fast armor facility would have been a better choice, or maybe even assault destroyers with a naval yard, but it's hard to say for sure. A lot of Allied players just rely so much on the airfield that they can do so much with it. They don't necessarily explore the other options that the Allies have. And I mean, we've seen some incredible stuff happen with armor facilities and naval yards in the past. So don't necessarily count out those strategies and only go for cryocopters, although cryocopter Vindicators and Peacekeepers are a very, very strong combo. So I'm not saying that those are bad in any ways. And Apollos is actually, one Apollo is going to be getting cleaned up there. A second one could be taking some damage, and it looks like it will. However, these 2 Javelin Troopers are not going to be able to finish off the job. YuiYui was just paying a little bit too much attention for that. But also, Dankal doesn't actually have an airfield. However, it looks like the Apollos of Dankal are going to be able to finish off 1 and potentially 2 with the help of Javelins. All 3 of them will actually go down, and the Cryocopter does stay alive. So YuiYui desperately trying to clean up the airspace and make sure that the Cryocopters don't actually take him out of this game, but he wasn't quite able to do it. However, he's in a significantly better economic position than Dankal. Dankal doesn't want to engage with his Vindicator just yet because he doesn't have the airfield. Until he gets the airfield back online, he doesn't necessarily want to waste all of the ammo for his units. YuiYui trying to establish some sort of build radius, but he's just not going to be able to do it. If he could get build radius, he could potentially be throwing down multi-gunner turrets or even a barracks of his own to start combating Dankal directly on the right side of the map. But for now, he just kind of has to sit there and watch his buildings drop because he has no build radius. We do have a lot of infantry going to be pumping up on the left side of the map here, going to be jumping up there and doing some damage. The engineer does get sniped. A nice move there by Dankal, but is it actually going to be worth it? However, where's the airfield? It needs to be going down at some point from YuiYui so that he can, or from Dankal, so that he can go ahead and get repairs and also refuel and refit his units. Because, of course, Vindicators and Apollos, not too good if they don't have any ammo, and, of course, they start to burn out if there is no airfield on the map, which actually that is happening right now. As you can see, the Vindicator is going to be slowly dying. The ore refinery does go down, which means even if Dankal ends up losing this, and actually a really great cryo shot from YuiYui is going to be freezing that ore collector in its tracks, and that was a nice kind of like a skeet shooting move there while you lead your target, which is something that not necessarily a lot of Allied players actually do. Some certainly do, and some try to do it, and then your opponent just reverse moves, and it kind of doesn't even do anything. So, I mean, it's always hard to decide whether you want to go for, like, do I straight up just take do I drop my cryo shot right on top of my opponent? Do I try to drop it where they will be? Or do I put it behind them just a little bit to make sure that they can't retreat and try to force an engagement that way? Those are kind of the 3 standard ideas that go into the cryo shot, and they have varying success. Of course, Cryogeddon makes it a little bit easier, but we do have a lot of Apollos and actually a couple of hydrofoils. So what we saw last time was 2 Apollos shred 3 Apollos, but the 2 Apollos of Dankal had the help and support of those Javelin Troopers. That's why they were able to win that match, or win that fight, rather, and keep the Cryocopter and the Vindicator alive. And then, of course, the nice control of Dankal, he was making sure that he was running his units around, not letting the Apollos just get shots off. But Dankal is currently going to be sitting on that 2 refinery economy, and you have to remember that when Dankal was on like 1 refinery economy, YuiYui was on 4 refineries, and that is of course going to be absolutely great for YuiYui. I think he actually, did he have that harvester just a little bit off? It's hard to tell, but it does get bugged there, which is very unfortunate. Too bad there isn't a custom bug fix patch for Railroad 3 to fix stuff like that, because that would be super awesome if it was. However, the airfield is down. YuiYui is still sitting on Tier 1. He might be researching the Tier 2, but he's once again just going for a brute force style. And Dankal, he is going to be queuing a multi-gunner turret, which is, of course, going to be very important. We do have both of the oil derricks are under the control of YuiYui. So Dankal stopped YuiYui once, but he was not able to stop him a second time. Cryocopters are going to be helping Dankal to be super efficient, and also if YuiYui tries to engage with just pure infantry and no vehicles against this multi-gunner turret with a Peacekeeper in it, it could be a very, very bad time for YuiYui. A little bit of a bad rally point is going to be sacrificing a couple of these Peacekeepers. I don't think YuiYui intended to do that. He just sort of forgot to move that waypoint and or click somewhere else if it was just a misclick. YuiYui is going to be establishing himself in the top left location, which means it's 3 refinery, 2 oil derricks versus just straight up 2 refineries of Dankal. And also we have a kind of sick concave coming out of YuiYui. Dankal is going to be trying to get a flank potentially with a Riptide and actually a Vindicator as well, and a Cryocopter. A couple of Apollos are going to be there for support. I don't know, I've actually got something in my throat. The Vindicator actually is going to be getting focused down, and both of the Apollos could be getting shredded as well. 2 engineers are inside of that Riptide, and Dankal didn't necessarily want to reveal that that's what he was doing. I'm thinking he was trying to be going for those, he was trying to go for those oil derricks, and actually it looks like the Cryocopter does get eliminated there. I have something in my throat, and I cannot speak. Man, I don't know what that is. But nice move there by YuiYui, clearing the skies. Once again, those Cryocopters can allow allied players to be so efficient with their units. I mean, a Peacekeeper can take out so many tanks and other, like, Imperial Warriors, conscripts, or other Peacekeepers with the help of a Cryocopter. And, of course, I mean, at the very least, the Cryocopters remove units DPS from battle. So actually the Apollos are going to be getting focused, and unfortunately for Dankal, he wasn't able to get the repairs on those units, and he wasn't actually able to get them back up to full health, so they both got cleaned up pretty darn quickly. 1 Javelin Trooper is going to be joining up with the rest of his friends, but he will get cleaned up there by that Peacekeeper multi-gunner turret, which is going to be nice for Dankal, but not too big of a deal. And actually Javelin Troopers finishing off a fully heroic Javelin Trooper of Dankal. Dankal, unfortunately, going to be leaving some of his units away from the Riptide, which means they won't be getting saved. And these Dolphins could actually go ahead and clean up the hydrofoils. We'll have to see if they choose to do that, but YuiYui is going to be taking down this oil derrick from Dankal, which is just nice of YuiYui to do. Well, it's not nice for Dankal, but it's nice for him just denying that income from Dankal. And assault destroyers are out. Most likely they are just going to be used for their black hole armor. And actually, a second one may end up getting caught, but an additional Riptide is going to be produced, and as long as it's a Riptide and an Assault Destroyer, there's not a whole lot that Dankal can actually do. We do have, on the high ground, a 3rd refinery potentially being established, but Cryoblast does fire off. It is going to be freezing a couple of Peacekeepers there, actually a fair number of them. However, YuiYui is going to be smashing that X key, splits up his units pretty well, and that generally works versus Cryoblast and Cryo Shot, even Cryogeddon if you get it early enough. And it did actually work quite nicely for YuiYui in this situation. Dankal dominating with his Black Hole Armor Assault Destroyer, which is, of course, going to be very nice for YuiYui, absorbing all of the damage from those Peacekeepers and the Javelin Troopers of Dankal. And of course, that Assault Destroyer it actually will escape. However, the Peacekeepers of Dankal are actually going to be shredding the remainder of this army. YuiYui desperately trying to clear out these buildings. If he can take down the airfield, that'll be a pretty big victory, although Dankal isn't really using it at this point. And YuiYui does manage to just barely clean up the Peacekeepers of his opponent. The sell-off does happen. The fire sale initiated, and there's only a barracks left for Dankal. He's trying to macro to the best of his ability with his Peacekeepers, and also selling off those power plants gave him a couple of extra Peacekeepers to use, but one refinery does get targeted down very quickly. Another one has been established in the north there, but isn't going to be enough. I mean, YuiYui is sitting on like 4 ref economy with an oil derrick, versus just the... Actually, is that a 4th ref? No, that's not a 4th ref, but it is going to be aircraft carriers. So actually, Dankal was able to clear the skies, or clear the ground, rather, with the help of the Peacekeepers out of the boot camp, and also the Peacekeepers out of those power plants. However, it looks like a couple of Peacekeepers from YuiYui were left out in the cold, and they will be getting cleaned up there by Dankal. But can Dankal actually deal with Riptide, so 2 Riptides, an Assault Destroyer, and 2 aircraft carriers, and a 3rd Riptide rallied in just for good measure, as well as 4 Apollos to make sure that there are no Cryocopters anywhere near any of YuiYui's forces. Dankal is going to be making one last defense, but really when you've got 1 naval yard, 2 refineries, and a barracks versus all of the stuff that YuiYui has, it would take an absolute miracle to actually pull off a win from this position. The power plant is going to be going down. Oh man, Dankal didn't actually have a power plant. He sold both of them off that were in his main base, well, his new main base. He sold them both off to go ahead and deal with the army of YuiYui. He sees the aircraft carriers, and GG's out of this game. YuiYui is going to be your victor, and he will take home the $140, which Dankal did take home 80 from that tournament, and hopefully those will be paid out very soon here, as the tournament was yesterday or the day before, so they should be moving to accounts relatively soon here, depending on how your bank works. But anyways, that will do it for this series. Kind of an unorthodox best of 7 where YuiYui just blitzed every game. He had an important event to go to. He still stuck around and played those matches. It's kind of unfortunate when a tournament goes on for like 7 to 8 hours because it kind of interferes with people's personal lives, which is a little bit unfortunate for them. So that's why the games were kind of wonky and definitely not the best games from either one of these players. Dankal was off racing for at least some of those games. I feel like Soviets is definitely his strongest faction, but he does enjoy playing random. And YuiYui was just straight up, I mean, you can call it cheesing for sure in some of those games. The last game, not so much, but he was definitely playing like a hyper-aggressive blitz cheese style where you just finish the game as quickly as possible. That game, a little bit more tactical, but still with the MCV push, it was just so weird, and I feel like Dankal wasn't really sure what he should do because the first games were so off the wall, and now Dankal is playing a different race than he played in all of those games, so he has to think about it quite a bit differently. I mean, there's not as much crossover with the 3 races. However, that will do it for this series. I hope you enjoyed it. The best of 7 goes to YuiYui, and that will do it. So thank you very much for watching. This is Sybert, signing out.